Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining us once again to another superb, we hope, Lockdown LitFest event, where it is my huge pleasure and honour to welcome to the Lockdown LitFest stage Joanne Harris. Most of you will know that she studied modern and medieval languages at Cambridge, so I'm not going to tell you that. You will also know that she was a teacher for 15 years, during which time she published 3 novels, including, of course, Chocolat. You'll know that she's written 15 more novels, 2 novellas, 2 collections of short stories, a Doctor Who novella, guest episodes for the game Zombies, run the libretti for 2 short operas, several screenplays, a musical, and 3 cookbooks. She works hard. What you may not know are that her hobbies, as listed in Who's Who, are mooching, lounging, strutting, strumming, priest baiting, and quiet subversion of the system. She also enjoys a little obfuscation, a little bit of sleaze, some mild rebellion, a certain amount of witchcraft, and a great deal of armed robbery, along with tea and biscuits. It is my great honor. Oh, also, I must point out, she has 2 honorary doctorates, which allows me to introduce to the Lockdown LitFest stage, Dr. Joanne Harris, MBE. Bonjour, Joanne, comment ça va?
Ça va bien, merci. Ravie d'être ici.
Très bien, merci. It's such a pleasure to have you here, Joanne, and thank you for coming to join us. You've written so much, and I know there's a book you particularly want to talk about, which I am really delighted that you published. But can we start back at the beginning? And as I said in the introduction, you were a teacher, and you'd written, it seems that writing runs through your blood. I assumed you come from a family of literophiles. Were your parents big readers? Did you have books in the house?
Oh yes, there were lots of books in the house, but most of them were in French. I don't think really there were very many English books. My mother is the great literary mind in the family. And yes, we had more books than we had furniture when I was growing up, but they were all by basically French novelists of a certain kind. And so I had a bit of a patchy introduction to literature. I was left very much on my own, because if it wasn't classic French literature, then it was basically whatever I could pick up from my grandfather, who was a great reader. And he read a lot of English novelists in French, which was how I got introduced to the works of Agatha Christie, who it took me very many years to understand wasn't actually a French author at all. But yes, I liked to read, and I was a member of the library. And so I would bring books out if I was allowed to, and if they were judged suitable by the librarian, which wasn't always a given in those days. I was allowed to join the children's library when I was 7, but I was told that I wasn't allowed to join the adult library until I was 16, which was a blow, because when I eventually did join the children's library, I realized that it was a shelf about so big. And there was a very fierce librarian lady called Mrs. Potts, who was there to keep an eye on me and make sure that I didn't go and read the unsuitable books. And by dint of pestering Mrs. Potts, I got permission, extraordinary permission, once I'd read the whole of the children's library, to take out 1 adult book a month, as long as she okayed it, and as long as I passed a little oral exam afterwards to prove that I'd understood it. And so the whole business of going to the library was fraught with difficulty, because my parents would leave me there on a Saturday morning. They would go shopping, and then I would speed read all the books that I knew I wasn't going to be able to get out. And then I would try and choose something that would pass the censor and also last me a month. And so length was quite important in those days.
How extraordinary. Whereabouts in France was this, John?
It was in England. It was in Barnsley.
Oh, this was
Barnsley had a central library at the top of the old centenary rooms. And it was a whole trek just to go there, because you had to go through a big ballroom with a marble staircase, and then there was another staircase on top of that, and then there were some spiral stairs, and the whole thing was in the top of the building. And it was a very old-fashioned, dark, dusty, spidery library. It was just the apotheosis of what a library ought to be, and it was magical.
It sounds magical. There's always I'm always fascinated by that crux, that fulcrum in a writer's life, when they realize that stories aren't just there to be consumed, they can be created as well. And we do that, of course, in essays at school and so on and so forth. But when did you sort of put pen to paper and think, right, I know I can be a storyteller. I'm loving reading stories. What's it like to create one? Do you remember that time?
It never occurred to me that anybody would want to be anything other than a storyteller. I took to reading quite badly and quite late. I think the phonetics of English just defeated me for a while, and so for a while I had to make up my own stories because I couldn't read them fast enough to satisfy me. And so I was already telling stories before I could read. And then when I did learn to read finally, and it made sense to me, and it did kind of click overnight, I just zoomed through everything that was available, whether it was children's literature or not, and I would read everything. But yes, it was an odd business because to me storytelling was a normal thing. I think perhaps because I had grandparents who were very good storytellers and had interesting life stories, which I would listen to because as a kid I paid attention to things like that. It just never occurred to me that anybody wasn't a storyteller.
And when you first published Evil Seed, what was your path to publication? Was that easy? One imagines, days when you could just write a story, you'd send it off to a publisher, and it would just get published. Is that what happened? How does that work? How did that work?
No, it didn't. It didn't happen that way. I didn't realize that you couldn't just send off a book to a publisher and expect to get published. I realized this after many, many failures at having got in touch with publishers. I realized that I needed an agent. I eventually talked an agent into taking me on, and he eventually got me a publisher. It took about 2 years, I think, from first contact with an agent who actually thought that my book might have some promise to actually getting the book out. It came out in paperback original and it duly sank without a trace because it was not really the kind of thing that was selling commercially at the time. It was a vampire novel, but it was also a novel with pretensions to being a literary novel, and I don't think anybody knew what it was. The sort of people who would have liked vampire novels would not have expected a book like that, and the kind of people who were looking for a literary novel wouldn't have read a vampire novel. And so it was kind of stuck between two areas, which didn't matter at all because I had a job, I was teaching, and just to see the book in print was already so exciting for me. I used to hang around the one bookshop in Barnsley that existed and stand by the one copy of my book that was there and hope that somebody would pick it up. And occasionally do that thing where you turn it out so that you can see the jacket design instead of just the spine. And the owner of the shop would just look at me in this kind of piercing way while I was there. And I assumed it was because he'd recognized me somehow. I think he thought I was stealing books.
Ian Rankin told a lovely story a couple of days ago when we were talking to him, saying that he was devastated to find his first Rebus book, Noughts and Crosses, in the detective fiction section, and he wanted to be with Muriel Spark, so he'd keep going back to the shop to move it back to the sort of the literary section alongside Muriel Spark, only to return the next day to find two disappointments: one that had been moved back to the detective fiction shelf, and also that it hadn't been sold, which is rather entertaining. You followed up The Evil Seed with Sleep Pale Sister, which was another sort of transition in your writing, because that took you from horror, from vampires, to a literary ghost story. Did the response to Evil Seed sort of inform how you approached the writing of Sleep Pale Sister?
No, not at all. I really wasn't thinking about an audience at that point.
Right.
I wasn't thinking about whether it would be commercial. In fact, if I had been, I would have written another vampire novel because that was what my publishers would have liked. And when they found that I hadn't written another vampire novel, they dropped me and I had to go with a different publisher with Sleep Pale Sister, it was a sort of serious historical ghost story. It was a Gothic novel basically set in the world of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood of Painters, and it was a pastiche. It was something that I was trying, and I'd been trying on different styles for size for some time. I hadn't really found my own voice. It was better than The Evil Seed. It was better written because The Evil Seed had taught me something, I think, about how to structure a novel, how to write the dialogue, how to develop. I was still very much feeling my way into this. Nobody had taught me how to do any of this stuff. And so it was all very much trial and error. But it was a better book, but it still wasn't in my voice. It was in a kind of hash of different voices, and mostly Wilkie Collins, I think. I wanted to write a Wilkie Collins ghost story.
Ah. I always get confused with it. Is that the woman in white or the woman in black? I can never remember.
Well, it was the woman in white, and I adopted Wilkie Collins's multiple first-person narrator style, and had, I think, 4 or 5 narrators, all kind of telling the story in their own way, and I really enjoyed doing it, but it wasn't something that I knew that I was going to continue doing in that way forever. I was trying things out in the search for a voice which would feel authentically mine.
What has always fascinated me about your writing career, Joanne, is just the flexibility of mind that you have and the flexibility of style. From the Rune series, obviously the series that started with Chocolat, the other novel set in France, Coastliners, 5 Quarters of the Orange, Holy Fools, the Malbury novels, the Gothic novels, cookbooks, folklore, short stories. I mean, you are eminently flexible. Can you, before we have to talk a little bit about Chocolat, I hope you don't mind. I'm hoping to do so. But do you have sort of a Venn diagram of where the story that you want to write fits in your sort of publishing oeuvre, into the canon of Joanne Harris, so to speak?
Well, I didn't used to, but now I've realized that there is more in common with all of my work than some people are aware. I think, the thing about having written now so many books in so many different areas is that there are people who will only read a certain kind of book. They'll only read either the mystery novels or the fantasy novels or the ones that are set in France. And then there are people who will read all across the spectrum. But because basically I am the spectrum, I can see where everything fits. And to me, it's not as diverse as people think it is, because I've never really believed that genre had to be a thing. I've always felt that genre was much more a marketing tool than something that was useful to authors or readers, really. And so I've realized that actually I've been developing the same ideas repeatedly in slightly different ways in all the books that I've written. At least all the books that I've written where I was writing as me rather than as Wilkie Collins or as Bram Stoker or as somebody else.
Quite. Can we come to Chocolat? I know you and I have discussed this at length in the past, but, and hard though it may be, can you take us back to the origins of that story and the origins of those fantastic characters that have, that half the world has fallen in love with?
Well, I think with Chocolat was the book where I kind of understood that I didn't have to be somebody else.
Yeah.
I wrote it in a voice which was very much my voice. It wasn't me doing another person's voice. And it was not in response to any kind of commercial ambition that I had, because I'd reached the point after 2 novels that really hadn't had any kind of commercial success. I'd reached the point where nobody wanted to publish me anymore. And my agent, who was a Hungarian guy called Richard Gollner, was getting slightly antsy about whether ever he would make any money out of me, which is, fair enough. And he sent my then manuscript, which was a prototype of a book which later became Holy Fools. He sent this off to America to one of his friends, who was also a literary agent and who had written a book called How to Write the Blockbuster Novel, a guy called Al Zuckerman, and he was supposed to be the world's authority on what makes a bestseller. And he sent Al Zuckerman my manuscript and said, well, I've got this author and I'd really like her to be published in the States, but we haven't had any luck so far. Can you help us? And so Al Zuckerman sent me about 20 pages of why I was doing it all wrong. And I wish I kept his letter, but by then I was making a sculpture out of all my rejection letters, and I think Al Zuckerman's letter kind of finished the head, and so it became part of this papier-mâché thing. But I remember what he said, and he said basically, you can write a bit. And I thought, I'll take that. And he said, but you're writing about the wrong thing, because your book, it's set in this little tiny place in Europe, and nobody cares about that kind of thing. You need to think big, and that means setting your story in American city, because people are interested in what happens in cities and not what happens in villages, which was a shame, because I lived in a village and I'd never been to America, and I really wasn't set up to write a book set there. But anyway, And he had a number of other things to say about my book. And he said, well, I don't understand why it's so parochial. I don't understand why there are so many old people in it. Nobody really wants to read about old people, because actually what you really need to do is to write sex, and a lot of it, because that will bring readers in. So obviously you can't have the old people having sex. So young people in a city is what you want to think about. And while I'm on the subject, perhaps, if you want to write a cookbook, you could go and write one, but there is no place for food in fiction. And so I went off with all of this. And I think by then I kind of realized that one of my main motivations for writing was to annoy people. I'd annoyed my mother enormously by writing The Evil Seed, because she had banned anything that she thought was horror or science fiction or fantasy from the house when I was a kid. And so it was inevitable that my rebellion when I left home was to write a book that she would hate, and indeed she did. And so the next thing that I did was to write a book that I thought Al Zuckerman would hate. And I set it in the most parochial, smallest of European villages, filled it with old people, stuffed it to the gills with food, and it became chocolat, and it did okay, actually. In fact, it did so okay that a year later, when it had been a bestseller and it was about to be a movie, Al came back to my then agent, because I'd got a new agent by then, and he'd obviously forgotten that he'd had any communication from me at all. And he asked my new agent whether her new and suddenly very successful author would like representation in the States, and suggested that perhaps he could do this. And it was one of the few wonderful moments of schadenfreude in my life when I was able to say, no, I think we've got that sorted, and turn him down. But yeah, it just goes to prove that people can't always predict what's going to happen in books. They can't predict what is going to be a bestseller or why. And so it was a big surprise to me that Chocolat did so well, because I had done everything that I'd been told not to do.
It sort of puts me in mind, is it William Goldman's screenwriting classic that has the great opening line, which I'm probably going to misquote, "Nobody knows anything"?
Nobody knows anything, and he's quite right. It's, you can guess at things, you can have experience of things, you can sometimes make a really good educated guess, but actually there is an enormous gulf between your educated guesswork and what might actually happen, even in publishing. And if publishers knew what makes a bestseller, there wouldn't be so many surprise bestsellers out there.
Exactly. Reading the accolades that Chocolat got you, it was number one on the Sunday Times bestseller list. It won the Creative Freedom Award in 1999, shortlist of the 1999 Whitbread Novel of the Year Award. Film rights were sold to David Brown, developed by Miramax, and of course, created the movie with Juliette Binoche and Johnny Depp. It also made you one of only the 4 female members of the Millionaires Club, that elite group of authors who achieved 1 million sales of a single book in the UK since records began. I don't quite know how to phrase this question to keep it polite, but did you jump for joy when you had? Did that mean something to you? Was there a sense of, I'm right, I'm here, I am a storyteller, or did you not need that sort of secondary affirmation?
Well, I don't know. I think, it took me a very long time to come to terms with any of that. It seemed a very long way away from me.
Right.
Most of what was happening in Hollywood. It was happening in America. It was happening in London. I was still living in Barnsley. I remember when the movie was about to come out, I remember a group of cameramen from ITV, I think, coming to my house, which was a little semi-detached house in Barnsley, and they asked me if Chocolat had changed my life, and they obviously wanted some sort of display of immense wealth.
Yes.
And I was still living in this shabby little house, and I had this old second-hand car that didn't start. And so I made a joke, and I said, well, these cushions are new. And there were 4 cushions on the sofa. And this is where I learned that you must never tell the truth to journalists, and you must never tell a joke, because, I had to pose with the cushions, be photographed with the cushions. And they were basically 10 quid cushions that I picked up in a sale somewhere. But that was, what I got from it came, I think, much later. And being in the Millionaires Club doesn't actually make you a millionaire. It means that you've sold 1 million copies, which is quite a different thing. And I think people assumed that I was suddenly immensely wealthy. But it doesn't work that way in books. I made enough money to be able to give up teaching and to feel that I could live on what I'd earned for maybe 3 or 4 years before I started to worry. And it was enough. It was a buffer between my nice day job, which I'd enjoyed and I'd been good at, and which had given me a pension and security and all sorts of things, and this unknown, this dream which I was pursuing without really knowing whether there was any future to it, because not all authors who write a best-selling novel ever write another one. Not all of them make a living from writing. So to me, it was a very risky thing, giving up teaching. It took me a long time to do it. I took a year's sabbatical so that I could promote the book. And then I just wrote more books and thought, well, fingers crossed. Hopefully, if I still keep these readers and they still listen to what I've got to say, then maybe I can do this for another year or another 2 years. And that was 21 years ago. And I'm still slightly hesitant to say I am a professional author. It's very odd. I still, when I meet those people in the streets, in the days where you used to meet people in the streets and talk to them, who say things like, what do you do for a living? Because they want you to fill in a questionnaire. I always find myself about to say, well, I'm a teacher on a very long sabbatical. Because, being an author is a very surreal thing to be. And it's also a very nebulous way of life.
Indeed. Although I have to point out, you are so modest that since Chocolat, all your books have been UK bestsellers. So I think you're justified now in saying I'm a writer to any charity collector on the street. Can I also point out?
I have a very loyal readership who have followed me to a lot of extraordinary places and who haven't put immense pressure on me to duplicate books. And most of my readers will have their favourite book. It's not always Chocolat, but I have not had anybody tell me I was disappointed because you didn't write Chocolat over and over again every year for the last 20 years, which is not something that I would have been able to do. But, I sense that my publishers would quite have liked it if I could have written another book about Vian every year and become a brand that way, and a predictable, easy to sell, comfortable brand. That would have been great for them, and it would have been very lucrative for me. But it's really not what I do.
No. Although I will point out, you have followed the Vian series the series. It's not a series, but Lollipop Shoes, which is just a beautiful book. And my particular favorite was Peaches for Monsieur le Curé, which is the sort of the third in that series. Can you bring us up to date? Because I understand Strawberry Thief is considered the fourth in the series that starts with Chocolat. Is that how you view it? Is that what you set out to write?
I never really think too far ahead about what I'm going to write, because it's not always a predictable business.
Right.
There is something about the characters in Chocolat which has stayed with me, and which has given me more stories and more opportunities to tell them. And I think what it is it's quite simple. Chocolat was the first book where I really wrote with my own voice about things that were personal to me. I think part of that was being a mother. My daughter at the time was 3, and I'd never written about the experience of motherhood before because I didn't know what it was like. But that story ended up being very much the story of a woman with a young child. And one of the reasons it took me a long time to follow that story up with something else was that I needed my daughter, Anushka, who is not dissimilar to Anouk in the book, to reach a certain age where I could write about being the mother of an older child or the mother of a teenager. With The Strawberry Thief, I am writing from the perspective of a mother whose daughter has left or is about to leave home. And I had to wait for that to happen too, for me to know how that would feel. so that I could still write about that relationship in a way that seemed to me authentic and meaningful, which is absolutely why I couldn't have written a book a year, or I wouldn't have wanted to, because I've always felt that if I wasn't writing about something new, if I wasn't exploring something or doing something differently, then there wasn't really much of a point me doing it at all. And so, it wasn't as if I planned ahead that I was going to write these books, but I knew that if I did revisit Vian and Anouk, it would have to be at intervals where I would have learnt something and where Vian would have changed because I had changed, and that central relationship had developed in some way. So 20 years have passed in real time, 16 years have passed in terms of the characters in the story, and Vian has had different experiences, been informed by different relationships, has had different adventures. And with The Strawberry Thief, she is back in Lansquenet very unexpectedly. This is the village where she was convinced she would never be able to go back. She would never be accepted. She has been accepted. She has found a place. She now belongs. Her daughter Anouk, her eldest daughter, has left home and is living in Paris with her boyfriend and probably won't come back, or at least doesn't want to come back and open a chocolate shop, which is kind of what Vian thought she would do. And Vian is left with her younger daughter, Rosette, who is 16 and who has a number of personality and behavioural issues that haven't entirely been explained because I wanted to keep them open to interpretation. And the book starts with a death. A lot of my stories begin with an arrival or a departure, and this starts with the death of the florist Narcisse, who is an old man by now, and who has been a minor character in all the books. And it starts with his death and a number of questions. One question is, why has he left part of his property, wood, to Rosette Rocher? What did he think he was doing that for? What's the story behind it? Another question is, what's going to happen to his florist shop, which is now going to be empty? Somebody is about to move in. Who will they be and what will they mean to Vian? And the third question is, why has he left his extended confession in the form of a manuscript to Renaud, the priest, who he's always hated? And what will Renaud do with the information in it? And so it's a number of mysteries wrapped in this story, and the story unfolds, and these questions end up informing the next stage of Vian's relationship with her daughter and her view of herself, because Vian is changing all the time and she is developing all the time, and she has a number of unresolved issues of her own which she's managed to carefully sidestep during all these years that she's been helping other people. But Vian is not great at helping herself, and this is the book where she confronts a reality of her own, a problem of her own that needs to be overcome before she can move on.
Beautifully described, Joanne. I like the fact that even Renaud, the priest, plays the role in this one. He's one of my, I know he's not a central character, but he's one of my favourite characters. You draw him so beautifully.
Like him too. I like him too. I think I was a little surprised that a lot of people thought that he was a bad guy in Chocolat. I never thought that he was a bad guy. I thought that there were a lot of things wrong with the way he saw the world, but I didn't think that he had, no potential for change. And he's actually had quite a journey throughout these books. And he has become a very different person now by the end, although it's not really the end because stories don't finish. And it could well be that there are more stories with those characters in them.
Quite. I should have asked you this before, Joanne, but is there any chance that you could read an extract for us from The Strawberry Thief?
Sure.
There's that piece that starts, "By now I ought to know that wind." I don't know if you have it to hand. Would that be possible?
I do have it to hand.
Marvelous.
I've got a proof here. It's a rather pretty proof that came out last year before the book came out in hardback.
Oh, that's cool.
Let me see.
While you find it, I'll introduce it. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said, we are sometimes going to be a little rough and ready around the edges, and that sometimes means that I don't fully get to prepare for interviews with some of my favorite world-beating authors, and this is one such time. So I promise you I haven't set this up. When you've asked me, when I asked Joanne if she could read, I actually had forgotten to brief her beforehand if she could. Such a lovely book, and talking about The Strawberry Thief has reminded me of some exquisite passages, and if Joanne would do us the honour of reading, it would be a delight to welcome Joanne Harris to read to the Lockdown LitFest audience. Please, Joanne.
Splendid. I'm going to read something from the beginning of the book before it gets too complicated. And because I've been talking about the relationship between Vian and Anouk, I'll read something in Vian's voice where she talks about her daughter. There she goes. How strange she is, my winter child, my changeling. Wild as an armful of birds, she flies everywhere in an instant. There is no keeping her inside, no making her sit quietly. She has never been like other girls, never like other children. Rosette is a force of nature, like the jackdaws that sit on the steeple and laugh, like a fall of unseasonal snow, like the blossom on the wind. Women, mothers, like Jolene Drou or Carole Clermont do not understand. The dread of having a different child is more than they can imagine. Nearly 16, and still Rosette cannot speak in the normal way. To them it makes my child a burden, pitiful, less than whole. To them she is poor Rosette, as I am poor Vian behind my back, left with that child to bring up alone, and the father so shockingly absent. But Carole and Jolene do not know how Rosette looks at me when I kiss her goodnight, or how she sings to herself in bed, or how she can draw any animal or bird or living creature. All they see is a little girl who can never grow up, and this they think is the saddest thing. A little girl who can never grow up will never fall in love, or be married, or get a job, or move away to the city. A little girl who can never grow up will be a burden forever. And her mother will never be able to go on that round-the-world cruise she had planned, or take up exciting new hobbies, or socialize at the country club. Instead, she will be doomed to stay here, in sleepy Lansquenet-sous-Than, hardly the kind of place in which you'd hope to stay forever. But I am not Carole Clermont, or Jolene Drou, or Michel Montour, and the thought of being rooted in one place, never to be blown away, is a dream I have cherished all my life. Small dreams are all I've ever had. Small dreams are all I hope for. A place in which the seeds I sow will grow into something I recognize. Clothes hanging in a wardrobe. A table scarred with familiar marks. A chair molded to my shape, maybe even a cat by the door. You see, I'm not demanding. These things are surely achievable. And yet, whenever I think that maybe I have silenced the wind's incessant demands, it begins to blow again. The weather changes. Friends die. Children grow up and move away. Even Anouk, my summer child, with her little messages and phone calls every Sunday, unless she forgets. Her eyes already alight with the thought of other places, new adventures. How strange. Anouk was always the one who wanted to settle down, to stay. Now her orbit has shifted, and it is his star she follows. It was inevitable, I know, and yet I sometimes find myself wishing. But not with Rosette. Rosette is mine. A special child, says Carole Clermont, with the pious expression that so belies the genuine disgust she feels. She must be a burden, thinks Caroline. A daughter who will never grow up, a child who can never be normal. She has no idea that this is precisely what makes Rosette so dear to me.
Joanne Harris, reading there from her latest book, The Strawberry Thief, which brings us right back to Vian and to a beautiful village called Lansquenet-sous-Than in the Gers region of France. I've seen a couple of early reviews for this book. So when somebody like James Runcie, who writes, sometimes you don't need to worry about a novel at all. You open the book, start reading, and find that it's sheer pleasure from start to finish. The Strawberry Thief is a delight. When those land on your doorstep, Joanne, does that fill your heart with joy?
Of course. To me, writing is such a joy anyway, that when other people get pleasure from it, it just seems the most wonderful thing. I mean, I would have written anyway. If none of my books had ever been published, I think I would have written them anyway. But having an audience, having readers who express their feelings about what you've written and say they've recognized things, they've recognized themselves, it's made them look at something in a different way. That's entirely magical. It's a kind of voodoo. You know, these little marks on the page that we write, these things that we just send out like little messages in bottles, and then they come back, and people have felt things. It's made them feel things. It's the most wonderful thing.
What gives me such joy is the accolades that you get from other writers who really appreciate the craft of what you put out. So you know, Marion Keyes has written the Strawberry Thief, so wise, so atmospheric, so beautifully written, and it fills my heart with joy. And if you are interested at all in Strawberry Thief, and of course, why wouldn't you be? There will be a buy the book button appearing at the bottom of this very screen quite shortly. I commend it to you. It's everything you would expect from a Joanne Harris novel, and yet more. Joanne, just a couple of things before we have to wrap up, because we're getting short on time. How is life in the shed? Because your shed has its own Twitter account, its own following, and there are millions of people around the world that watch the shed. How's shed life in a time of lockdown?
Well, it's not all that different from ordinary times, because the shed changes shape and appearance and location every day anyway. It's been particularly active recently because in lockdown, that is the place I'm most likely to travel to other places. I actually fell out of the shed the other day. I don't quite know how I did it. I think it was changing aspects somehow. I managed to fall down the one step that leads down to the shed and sprain my ankle. But no, I'm spending quite a lot of time in here. It's a good time for me to work. It's my optimal workspace. And so I'm using lockdown to escape into stories, the way I always have done, actually.
A number of authors have been talking to me of late in these rather anxious-making times, anxiety-inducing times, about normally as a successful author who sells abroad, there is so much pressure for the press and publicity tours to go and talk to TV stations, to go and talk to people, idiots like me, I suppose. It distracts from the writing that has to be done, that creates everything. Are you finding this time it puts you back into the mold of being a writer and not having to be a publicist for your work?
In a sense, it's the first time in 20 years where I haven't felt that I had an event just round the corner.
I'm so sorry, Joe. Would you mind saying that again? We had a huge microphone crackle, and I think it might be our fault. Would you mind starting again? I'm so sorry.
It's the first time in 20 years where I've not had some literary event or festival on the immediate horizon. It's very odd. I mean, I like literary events and festivals. I think that the human stimulus of these things is one of the important things that kind of feeds into my process. But on the other hand, it's also an interesting thing to have this time, this unexpected amount of time. And I think I'm working faster than I've ever worked before in some ways. I know some of my friends who are writers have found it really hard to get away from current events and to get back into writing, and I can understand this. But with me, it's always been an escape from things anyway. So I feel very much as if I'm in a kind of little spaceship, and I'm moving further and further away from reality. I'm not sure if that's entirely a good thing, but it's how it feels at the moment.
And I should have asked this at the top of the show. You and your family are well and safe. I know you, like me and like so many of us, are looking after elderly parents and have concerns on that area. Is everybody being careful? Are you all well?
We're all well, yes. I mean, Kevin and I have been locked down in this house for 5 weeks now. My parents live in the village. Both of them are old and vulnerable to various infections. My dad has COPD. It would be important for them not to get the coronavirus. So I'm kind of looking after them. They're 2 minutes walk away. So we're isolating because of them. So that there is that. But, you know, I'm not too worried about them. They seem to be fine. We're fine. I'm very lucky in that I have a big house, a big garden space. My daughter and her husband are in London. I worry about them slightly, but I talk to them nearly every day. So there again, it's, you know, we have been, fingers crossed, so far very, very lucky.
I'm delighted. On behalf of all of us here at Lockdown LitFest, the whole team and the entire audience, can I just say a couple of things? Thank you so much for coming to join us. I know you give so freely of your time with your role in the Society of Authors and so many other areas in which you are not only sort of a figurehead, but also very active on the ground. We are so appreciative. Thank you so much for writing The Strawberry Thief, which I have so thoroughly enjoyed. And please do look after yourself. And perhaps when we have hundreds of thousands of people tuning in, you will come back and tell more people. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been such a pleasure to talk to my dear pal, Joanne Harris, who gives so freely of her time and who really, really cares about her writing. And nowhere has this been more provable than in The Strawberry Thief, which I cannot commend to you highly enough. And if you haven't read Lollipop Shoes and Peaches from Monsieur le Curé, can I point you to those as well? Because they are just fantastic. And there's another little quote from Christopher Fowler, who's another very fine author and a big fan of Joanne's, who has written, "With The Strawberry Thief, Harris proves that earlier episodes of Chocolat were only the first tiers in an expanding box of delights. But just as she reveals new layers in her mysterious, magical world, she also opens a doorway to darkness. Mark her down as a sweet tooth at your peril, for there's a sharp bite too. I devoured it in one go." Joanne Harris, thank you so much for joining us. And as ever, ladies and gentlemen, look after yourselves, be well, take care, and be kind to the people you love. Cheerio.
Thank you.